The history of the ancient world is full of amazing personalities and the events they caused through their great deeds. One of these was Akhenaten, the pharaoh of Egypt, the husband of the beautiful Nefertiti, and the father of the legendary Tutankhamun. It is with him that the history of monotheism, or monotheism, begins. He was the first to challenge centuries-old tradition and plunge Egypt into the abyss of unprecedented changes. And even though subsequent pharaohs did everything to erase his name and deeds from the page of history, we still know enough to tell a brief history of this amazing man. Akhenaten was born in the 14th century BC, under his father, Pharaoh Amenhotep III. Ancient Egypt was at the very zenith of its power and greatness. Egyptian armies marched on the same borders of Babylon, and Egyptian governors sat in Syria and Palestine. Even though Akhenaten was the youngest son of Amenhotep, it was he, while still very young, who was destined to lead the most powerful state in the world. The unexpected death of his father and older brother Thutmose allowed Akhenaten, who at that time was still called Amenhotep IV, to take the reins of power over Egypt into his own hands. From the very first years of the reign of the new pharaoh, it becomes clear to everyone that great upheavals await Egypt. Akhenaten challenges the Egyptian priests, one of the most powerful forces of the state, and does not cast out their supreme god, Amon, putting in his place the god of the solar disk Aten, in whose honor the pharaoh himself takes a new name, under which he went down in history, Akhenaten, that is, the pleasing Aten. Over time, the cult of Aten becomes more centralized and intolerant of other gods. Grandiose temples are built in honor of Aten, and temples to other gods, primarily Omen, fall into disrepair. Priests who disagree with the pharaoh's new policy are forced to flee or hide. Akhenaten himself becomes the head of the cult of Aten, and at some point even identifies himself with this god. At the same time, the image of Aten, known since ancient times in the form of a man with the head of a falcon, under Akhenaten gradually loses its anthropomorphic features and begins to be depicted as the sun with a royal snake and arms directed from it instead of rays. Ultimately, Aten becomes a divine symbol, placed, as it were, inside Akhenaten himself, the first and only god of man. The veneration of other gods is prohibited not only under the threat of death, but also the burning of the body, which for the Egyptians meant the impossibility of existing in the kingdom of the dead. Aten becomes the only god, fulfilling the role of all past deities whose names and images are mercilessly erased by Akhenaten's servants throughout Egypt. And even the name of his father Amenhotep, that is, pleasing to Amon, is sacrificed to oblivion. All this allowed the young pharaoh to concentrate in his hands almost all the power in the Egyptian state, becoming not only a secular ruler but also a religious leader. The boundaries between the sun and the pharaoh were erased. Under Akhenaten in Egypt, for the first time in the history of mankind, primitive monotheism or monotheism was formed, the center of which was the pharaoh's son. It is also curious that Moses, the creator of Judaism, the first of the Abrahamic movements, lived in Egypt shortly after the death of Akhenaten himself and, most likely, was familiar with the teachings of the pharaoh, which gave many researchers reason to assume that Akhenaten was the founder of the Abrahamic religions. In particular, Sigmund Freud even presents Moses as a priest, created by Akhenaten of religion, who was forced to flee and leave Egypt after the old elites came to power. Religious reforms and Akhenaten's desire for change led to the need for a new capital. Thebes is the traditional center of Ammonius worship. Due to open confrontation with his priests, it becomes an extremely unsuitable place to house the pharaoh's family and his entourage. Therefore, in the 5th year of his reign, Akhenaten ordered the construction of a new capital 300 kilometers north of Thebes, called Akhenaten, that is, the horizon of Aten. Majestic palaces are erected in it for the pharaoh and his dignitaries. Artists from all over Egypt flock to the city and decorate Akhenaten with paintings and gold-covered statues of the pharaoh himself. The new capital was declared the Monastery of the Sun and became a kind of Mecca for Egyptian pilgrims. However, the pharaoh was concerned not only with religious reforms. Under him, a transition to a new stage of Egyptian art took place. Akhenaten is trying to abandon tradition in everything and introduce a new view of the world, which is most clearly manifested in art. Sculptors move from an idealized image to a realistic one. If the elderly pharaohs were depicted as majestic demigods who knew no flaws and crushed their enemies, then Akhenaten in sculpture and painting acquired the features of an ordinary and imperfect person. He develops a sagging belly, an awkward figure, and an irregular skull, and he appears in the image of a simple family man. It is worth adding that it was during this period that the magnificent bust of Nefertiti was made, the pride of modern archaeology. Under the influence of the solar cult in Egypt, the layout of temple buildings also changed. Now they are built in such a way that as much sunlight as possible enters the room. The services themselves are held outdoors. Poetic prayer chants are also created, dedicated to Aten, and generally reminiscent of biblical psalms. However, no matter what outstanding deeds Akhenaten performed in domestic politics, his weakest link was foreign policy. Egypt, being a superpower of its time, had to constantly have a large army, as well as loyal allies dependent on the will of the pharaoh. But Akhenaten's world did not extend beyond the national Egyptian lands. He stopped making lavish gifts to the Babylonian and Chthonic rulers. Under him, the powerful Egyptian army remained inactive and did not protect the Egyptian governors in Syria and Palestine. Many of them were killed, and the cities were plundered and burned. But Akhenaten seemed not to even pay his divine attention to these little things. However, there were enough problems within Egypt itself. Of course, Akhenaten made many changes in the field of religion and art, but he ignored pressing issues. Almost all of this was led by his wife, Nefertiti, whose authority, of course, did not equal the authority of the pharaoh himself. As a result, corruption and arbitrariness of local officials began to flourish in Egypt. On top of that, it was in the direction of Nathan that one of the strongest epidemics hit, which many considered to be a punishment from the gods who were angry with the arrogant pharaoh. Ultimately, Akhenaten's short-sighted policies lead to a terrible crisis in the recently powerful Egypt. Having reigned for a short 17 years, he dies under unclear circumstances. After his death, several pharaohs change at once. At the same time, one of them, Horemheb, tried to consign the name of Akhenaten himself to oblivion, just like he did with Amon. After the death of Akhenaten, the cult of Aten declined, and Amon again regains his status as the supreme deity. The name of the solar pharaoh is crossed out everywhere. His images and sculptures are destroyed, and Akhenaten's body is transferred from the royal tomb to the new capital, the Valley of the Kings. Because of these and many other events, it is extremely difficult to say what happened in Egypt at the end of Akhenaten's reign. The cause of his death is also unclear. One of the most likely assumptions is a protracted civil war caused by dissatisfaction with the policies of the pharaoh. In conclusion, it is worth saying that Akhenaten was an extremely controversial figure. Beginning as a prophet of a new religion that may have inspired all subsequent Abrahamic religions, he ended up as a selfish and far-sighted ruler who elevated himself to the level of a god but forgot about his people. His dreams did not come into contact with reality, which almost destroyed the Egyptian power. Nevertheless, it was Akhenaten who was the first who fearlessly opposed the immemorial tradition and paganism. Thanks to everyone who watched this video to the end. To find out about the latest releases, you just need to subscribe to the channel and click on the bell. Also, leave your thoughts in the comments and give it a thumbs up. See you soon.